In these final pages of Schopenhauer's essay on the sufferings of the world from Studies in Pessimism, he begins by discussing Buddhist and Zoroastrian cosmology, a theory of the universe, and the place of human suffering in it. He argues strongly against the existence of any kind of benevolent creator God, like in the Jewish and Christian traditions. And then he articulates something which I think of as being an interesting world which contains sin, but no deity who is sinned against. There's no lawgiver whose rules we have broken that constitutes our sin. We'll take a look at what Schopenhauer says about that. And then, rather surprisingly to me, he identifies his own philosophy with true Christianity. He indicates that what is really ultimately true in the Christian view of the world is presented in a more complete form in his, Schopenhauer's, pessimistic philosophy. That's one place where students of Nietzsche might find an interesting convergence, where Nietzsche would reject both Schopenhauer and Christianity, perhaps in part because of this perceived continuity between them. And then he concludes this essay with a rather beautiful defense of the life philosophy of pessimism, especially in terms of its moral benefits to the person who becomes a pessimist. So we'll finish with that. But here's what Schopenhauer writes. Brahma is said to have produced the world by a kind of fall or mistake. And in order to atone for his folly, he is bound to remain in it himself until he works out his redemption. As an account of the origin of things, that is admirable. According to the doctrines of Buddhism, the world came into being as the result of some inexplicable disturbance in the heavenly calm of nirvana, that blessed state obtained by expiation, which had endured so long a time, the change taking place by a kind of fatality. This explanation must be understood as having at bottom some moral bearing, although it is illustrated by an exactly parallel theory in the domain of physical science, which places the origin of the sun in a primitive streak of mist formed one knows not how. Subsequently, by a series of moral errors, the world became gradually worse and worse, true of the physical orders as well, until it assumed the dismal aspect it wears today. Excellent. I'll pause here to note that Schopenhauer is giving us a portrait of Buddhism, according to which the world, in a sense, kind of falls into existence. Right? And I think that there's a sort of decline from the blessed state of peace and tranquility in nirvana into the world of struggle and strife and physical existence that we know today. Schopenhauer approves of this and notes that it is both physical and moral in its character. The world becomes worse and worse. The world becomes more and more, we might say, chaotic in a physical sense, greater and greater entropy. We are in a bad state progressing towards a worse state, and that's the very nature of this existence. So he goes on. The Greeks looked upon the world and the gods as the work of an inscrutable necessity. A passable explanation. We may be content with it until we can get a better. Again, Ormuzd and Ahriman are rival powers, continually at war. That is not bad. But that a god like Jehovah should have created this world of misery and woe out of pure caprice and because he enjoyed doing it, and should then have clapped his hands in praise of his own work and declared everything to be very good, that will not do at all. In its explanation of the origin of the world, Judaism is inferior to any other form of religious doctrine professed by a civilized nation. And it is quite in keeping with this that it is the only one which presents no trace whatever of any belief in the immortality of the soul. Even though Leibniz's contention that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, that would not justify God in having created it. For he is the creator not of the world only, but of possibility itself. And therefore, he ought to have so ordered possibility as that it would admit of something better. And I'll just note, this is a standard atheist critique of theism, that if God is infinitely powerful, he could have created the world with a different possibility structure such that it wouldn't be as miserable as it is now. I'm not going to break open that question to try to examine and respond to it, but just note that Schopenhauer is writing in a well trod lane at this point. Continuing. There are two things which make it impossible to believe that this world is the successful work of an all-wise, all-good, and at the same time all-powerful being. Firstly, the misery which abounds in it everywhere. And secondly, the obvious imperfection of its highest product, man, who is a burlesque of what he should be. These things cannot be reconciled with any such belief. On the contrary, they are just the facts which support what I have been saying. They are our authority for viewing the world as the outcome of our own misdeeds, and therefore as something that had better not have been. Whilst under the former hypothesis they amount to a bitter accusation against the Creator and supply material for sarcasm, under the latter they form an indictment against our own nature, our own will, and teach us a lesson of humility. They lead us to see that, like the children of a libertine, we come into the world with the burden of sin upon us, and that it is only through having continually to atone for this sin that our existence is so miserable, and that its end is death. Continuing here his critique of theism, of Christianity and Judaism, their belief in an omnipotent, benevolent creator God, Schopenhauer points out, as he said, two types of evidence. One, the misery of the world. Second, the imperfection of the highest being in the world, man. He calls him a burlesque of what he should be. My philosopher's ears prick up, and I wonder, what is the nature of that should? Where's the normative force of it come from? In what sense should man be better than the absurd being that he is? Perhaps Schopenhauer means he aspires to better, or we really have a deep sense that we ought to be better than we are, that our own existence by our very living out of it is falling short, as even being a kind of absurd parody of what a spiritual being would like to be. So that's interesting for me, and I think worth further thinking about. He says the sufferings of this world and the imperfection of man, on the assumption that God exists, these are an indictment of the Creator for making things this way. On Schopenhauer's assumption, this sort of more Buddhist assumption that this world is a mistake, the idea is that the mistake was ours. There's a sort of, this world and its suffering result from our own error, sin, and activity and striving, and that's the sense in which it makes sense to say that this world should not have been. It would be better if it were not. It would be better if we had not sinned, if we had not erred, if we had not fallen into this state of being. Continuing with Schopenhauer now. There is nothing more certain than the general truth that it is the grievous sin of the world which has produced the grievous suffering of the world. I am not referring here to the physical connection between these two things lying in the realm of experience. My meaning is metaphysical. Accordingly, the sole thing that reconciles me to the Old Testament is the story of the fall. In my eyes, it is the only metaphysical truth in that book, even though it appears in the form of an allegory. There seems to me no better explanation of our existence than that it is the result of some false step, some sin of which we are paying the penalty. I cannot refrain from recommending the thoughtful reader a popular, but at the same time profound treatise on this subject by Claudius, which exhibits the essentially pessimistic spirit of Christianity. It is entitled, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake." Translator's footnote. Matthias Claudius, 1740 to 1815, a popular poet and friend of Klopstock, Herder, and Lessing. He edited the Wandsbeker Bote, in the fourth part of which appeared the treatise mentioned above. He generally wrote under the pseudonym of Asmus, and Schopenhauer often refers to him by this name. I think that's quite interesting. Cursed is the ground for thy sake by Matthias Claudius. Perhaps I'll look that up and we'll take a look at it later on. Between the ethics of the Greeks and the ethics of the Hindus, there is a glaring contrast. In the one case, with the exception, it must be confessed, of Plato, the object of ethics is to enable a man to lead a happy life. In the other, it is to free and redeem him from life altogether, as is directly stated in the very first words of the Sankhya Karika. Allied with this is the contrast between the Greek and the Christian idea of death. It is strikingly presented in a visible form on a fine antique sarcophagus in the gallery of Florence, which exhibits in relief the whole series of ceremonies attending a wedding in ancient times, from the formal offer to the evening when Hymen's torch lights the happy couple home. Compare with that the Christian coffin, draped in mournful black and surmounted with a crucifix. How much significance there is in these two ways of finding comfort in death. They are opposed to each other, but each is right. The one points to the affirmation of the will to live, which remains sure of life for all time, however rapidly its forms may change. The other, in the symbol of suffering and death, points to the denial of the will to live, to redemption from this world, the domain of death and devil. And in the question between the affirmation and the denial of the will to live, Christianity is, in the last resort, right. Here, I think we see maybe the most fundamental fissure between Schopenhauer's philosophy and Nietzsche's, where Nietzsche would celebrate the will to live. We would expect, hearing this description, knowing Nietzsche, to see him praise the fact that the sarcophagus, which is an artifact of death, is decorated with these elements to remind us of the glory of life, of a wedding, of the beginning of a wedding, of the end of a wedding, of all the things that are the joys of life, affirming the will to live, even on the artifact and the institution of death, the sarcophagus, which contains the corpse. And then the Christian coffin, it's somber, it's dark, it contains only a simple crucifix on it with its corpus, its symbol of the tortured and dead Jesus. And Schopenhauer here, maybe quite opposite to Nietzsche, what we expect of Nietzsche, says, actually, the Christians have this one right. The denial of this will to live, of the will to live in this world, is, in fact, valuable, maybe the most valuable thing about the Christian view of life. So if we wanted to put Nietzsche side by side with Schopenhauer, I think this would be a text that would absolutely allow us to do so. So going on with what Schopenhauer writes. The contrast which the New Testament presents when compared with the Old, according to the ecclesiastical view of the matter, is just that existing between my ethical system and the moral philosophy of Europe. The Old Testament represents man as under the dominion of the law, in which, however, there is no redemption. The New Testament declares law to have failed, frees man from its dominion, and in its stead preaches the kingdom of grace, to be won by faith, love of neighbor, and entire sacrifice of self. This is the path of redemption from the evil of the world. The spirit of the New Testament is undoubtedly asceticism, however your Protestants and rationalists may twist it to suit their purpose. Asceticism is the denial of the will to live, and the transition from the Old Testament to the New, from the dominion of law to that of faith, from justification by works to redemption through the mediator, from the domain of sin and death to eternal life in Christ, means, when taken in its real sense, the transition from the merely moral virtues to the denial of the will to live. My philosophy shows the metaphysical foundation of justice and the love of mankind, and points to the goal to which those virtues necessarily lead, if they are practiced in perfection. At the same time, it is candid in confessing that a man must turn his back upon the world, and that the denial of the will to live is the way of redemption. It is therefore really at one with the spirit of the New Testament, whilst all other systems are couched in the spirit of the Old. That is to say, theoretically as well as practically, their result is Judaism, mere despotic theism. In this sense, then, my doctrine might be called the only true Christian philosophy. However paradoxical a statement this may seem to people who take superficial views instead of penetrating to the heart of the matter. I'll pause here again for a brief comment. Really, Schopenhauer has laid it out very directly here, right? The contrast between the New and the Old Testament, think of it as the contrast between Schopenhauer's philosophy, that's the New Testament, denial of the will to live, the triumph of asceticism, and the Old Testament, man under the dominion of the law, or his great expression here, mere despotic theism, which identifies with Judaism, I think maybe in a similar way to Nietzsche and most 19th century Germans, I expect. And here also Schopenhauer defends the idea that our ultimate path of redemption from the suffering of this world will be something like what Christianity recommends, a sacrifice of self, a living for others, a denial of the will to live, or perhaps as I put it just a bit ago, a denial of the will to live in this world. But the true metaphysical basis of this is not a transition to some heavenly state as a sort of reward, we might think, from a crude perspective, but rather a transition towards non-existence, something much more Buddhist in its sort of fundamental metaphysics. So, taken in its very real sense, Christianity is about the transition from the moral virtues, obedience to the law, with which we might also identify Kant among modern philosophers, transition from that to the more radical denial of the will to live and the living out this will against life. We can already see Nietzsche, this is something that if we know Nietzsche will reject vigorously in favor of the will to power, which he calls the will to life, the will to live most fully and to exercise your power to strive and win in this world. Schopenhauer is saying, no, that's the path to misery, to frustration. The path away from it is the path towards peace and tranquility, inside as well as in action. So, going on. If you want a safe compass to guide you through life and to banish all doubt as to the right way of looking at it, you cannot do better than accustom yourself to regard this world as a penitentiary, a sort of penal colony, or ergasterion, as the earliest philosopher called it. The footnote here is to Clement of Alexandria, by the way. Amongst the Christian fathers, Origen, with praiseworthy courage, took this view, which is further justified by certain objective theories of life. I refer not to my own philosophy alone, but to the wisdom of the ages, as expressed in Brahmanism and Buddhism, and in the sayings of Greek philosophers like Empedocles and Pythagoras, as also by Cicero in his remark that the wise men of old used to teach that we come into this world to pay the penalty of a crime committed in another state of existence, a doctrine which formed part of the initiation into the mysteries. And Vanini, whom his contemporaries burned, finding that an easier task than to confute him, puts the same thing in a very forcible way. Man, he says, is so full of every kind of misery that, were it not repugnant to the Christian religion, I should venture to affirm that if evil spirits exist at all, they have passed into human form and are now atoning for their crimes. And true Christianity, using the word in its right sense, also regards our existence as the consequence of sin and error. If you accustom yourself to this view of life, you will regulate your expectations accordingly, and cease to look upon all its disagreeable incidents, great and small, its sufferings, its worries, its misery, as anything unusual or irregular. Nay, you will find that everything is as it should be, in a world where each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. Amongst the evils of a penal colony is the society of those who form it. And if the reader is worthy of better company, he will need no words from me to remind him of what he has to put up with at present. If he has a soul above the common, Or, if he is a man of genius, he will occasionally feel like some noble prisoner of state condemned to work in the galleys with common criminals, and he will follow his example and try to isolate himself. Another repetition here of a standard theme we find in Schopenhauer's practical philosophy, that the man of genius or superior spirit will necessarily be isolated from his fellows. The metaphor here, quite a memorable one. He will feel like a noble prisoner, like, say, a prince or a dispossessed king who has been thrown into the galleys, into the mines with to do manual labor with people of a very different class from himself. And like such a character in fiction, he will find that the only way really to maintain himself is to isolate himself and withdraw from the society of his fellow people. Or the great line, right? One of the evils of a penal colony is the society of the people in it. You're forced to live among criminals and fellow criminals. I also just want to repeat what I think is a great line in this paragraph. Each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. I like that very much. Going on now to the end of this chapter. In general, however, it should be said that this view of life will enable us to contemplate the so-called imperfections of the great majority of men, their moral and intellectual deficiencies, and the resulting base type of countenance, without any surprise, to say nothing of indignation, for we shall never cease to reflect where we are, and that the men about us are beings conceived and born in sin, and living to atone for it. That is what Christianity means in speaking of the sinful nature of man. Pardons the word to all. That's a quote from Shakespeare's Cymbeline. Whatever folly men commit, be their shortcomings or their vices what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and vices that we behold. They are the shortcomings of humanity, to which we belong, whose faults, one and all, we share. Yes, even those very faults at which we now wax so indignant, merely because they have not yet appeared in ourselves. They are faults that do not lie on the surface, but they exist down there in the depths of our nature, and should anything call them forth, they will come and show themselves just as we now see them in others. One man, it is true, may have faults that are absent in his fellow, and it is undeniable that the sum total of bad qualities is in some cases very large, for the difference of individuality between man and man passes all measure. In fact, the conviction that the world and man is something that had better not have been is of a kind to fill us with indulgence towards one another. Nay, from this point of view, we might well consider the proper form of address to be not Monsieur, Sir, mein Herr, but my fellow sufferer, soci malorum, compagnon de misère. This may perhaps sound strange, but it is in keeping with the facts. It puts others in a right light, and it reminds us of that which is, after all, the most necessary thing in life: the tolerance, patience, regard, and love of neighbor, of which everyone stands in need, and which, therefore, every man owes to his fellow. That's the conclusion of the essay on the sufferings of the world. And as I said at the beginning, I think it's a very beautiful and even eloquent defense of pessimism as a life philosophy. When we are pessimistic, we will cease to be surprised and very much cease to be indignant or angry at the failings of other people. We will recognize their failings as the common failings of the human race, as sins that we have not committed only because we haven't had the opportunity or the disposition yet. But by identifying with the errors and sins and the sort of horror of mankind, we acquire a certain kind of indulgence and respect, and he says even love of neighbor, not what you might expect from a cynic, from a pessimist who you might expect to become a cynic and a misanthrope. This is what in a previous video I think I called Schopenhauer's almost philanthropic misanthropy. That doesn't make any sense, of course, it's a paradox, but there's this way in which a recognition of the truly awful state of our affairs frees us from any hope of making it better, and it also makes us much more sympathetic and kind towards the people we live among, even as we are kind of withdrawing from them, perhaps inwardly. So that is the conclusion of this essay. I hope you found this video helpful and rewarding. I'll try to get into some other essays from Studies in Pessimism in future videos. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.